Today, we become legends.
Premade builds can be useful, especially for new players, but everyone should be looking to adapt their build to the situation. This video should help you with that. Hey, my name's Inter, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, then be sure to subscribe for all my content coming soon. Today, I'm going to explain how I and other good players decide what to build in which situations, and how we change our builds on the fly to get the maximum out of our gods. I challenge you to find a single player above Platinum ranks who relies on the same pre-made build every game, because you won't find one. Decent players know what items are good for which gods and which situations, and in this video I aim to pass some of that knowledge onto you. So the first and most important thing you need to ask yourself is, which stats does my god make the best use of? If you're building attack speed on Thor or crit on Set, then you're probably doing something wrong. Look at what your god actually does throughout the course of the game. Are you playing an assassin that does most of their damage through abilities? You probably need cooldown reduction. Or is it the opposite? Do you do most of your damage through auto attacks? Well, you probably need attack speed, maybe some crit, maybe some kin size. The idea here in this video is to give you the tools you need to figure out a solid build on your own and lessen your reliance on looking up a build every time you try a new god. When a new god releases, no one has optimized builds that I can look up, so I just have to make my own based on the stats I think that god will do well with. This is something you'll learn over time, but here's a few quick pointers in terms of useful stats for certain archetypes. Any damage dealer will of course want power and penetration, and any tank will of course need health and a good balance of protections. Those two basic rules are something that I think every new player probably understands, although penetration is a lot more important than most players give it credit for. But going beyond that, if your character is ability based, i.e. they do a majority of their damage through abilities or auto attack cancelling, you'll need cooldown reduction as well. If you're on the opposite side and use auto attacks more than abilities, you'll need attack speed. Tanks can often make good use of crowd control reduction in their builds if you can fit it in. CCR is a very underrated stat. Also, if you're an ADC, then you're usually going to need some kind of augment to your basic attacks in terms of damage. This will usually be either kin size or some crit in your build. The decision here is usually based on if you want to kill tanks versus kill squishies respectively, but there's also an element of consistency there too. So once you've figured out what stats you need, you should just buy a bunch of items with those stats and you're good to go, right? Well, not really. Power curves are very important in Smite. That's the reason everyone, well, except Rat I guess, builds boots first item. Yes, the movement speed is very important, but they're also just very efficient for the cost, and no other 1600 gold item will give you as many stats as early boots do. So your typical Smite build will consist of your starter item, followed by boots, followed by an early game bridge item. This can be a cost-efficient item that allows you to get online early on. This is often built on mids and junglers to get that power spike super early. A stacking item to get going early on in your build, usually on hunters, but on some others too. Or defense against the type of damage you're going to be taking the most of if you're a tank. You then usually have a few mid-game items that are pretty interchangeable, followed by your late-game powerhouse items that are very bad value, so you don't build them early on, but they have the best stats of any item, so you do want to build them somewhere in your build. These items are things like Heartseeker, Rod of Tahuti before the Season 8 changes I guess since everyone rushes it now, Mantle of Discord, Deathbringer, those kind of items. So you take your best stats and create a build around a good power curve. Done? Not quite. You also have to take into account counter building, which is the most difficult part of creating builds that can adapt to the situation. There are tons of items in Smite that aren't typically going to go into your default build, but become worth going over one of your normal items in certain circumstances. For example, against an Aphrodite or a Hell, you may want to trade your Spear of Desolation on your mage and replace it with Divine Ruin. If you're getting CC'd down very heavily and dying before you could really do anything, you might want to slot in Magi's Cloak somewhere in that mage build. If you're getting tons of kills as a jungler and you want to snowball, maybe try Bloodforge. And this is really the final piece of the puzzle in terms of creating a good build. So first, identify the key stats of your god, then find items with good distributions of those stats and arrange them in an order that gives a solid power curve, with some early cost-effective items transitioning into some late-game powerhouse items later in the build. Then apply counter building and be ready to swap out one or maybe even two of your typical items for something better for the situation, and you're golden. A quick note on starter items, you can pretty much use the same process for choosing a good starter item for your god. Do you use tons of abilities for damage and solo lane? Bluestone Pendant probably. Are you a big AoE burst damage mid laner? Probably Archmage's Gem. You get the picture. So here's a quick example of this system when applied to Thor. Of course, I know how to build Thor, so this won't be completely authentic, but I never rely on a generic 6-item build for him and tend to just make up my build as I go along, which allows me to really adapt to the situation and maybe even find new items that I like more than old ones I've been using. So Thor is an ability-based burst damage assassin with strong mobility, combos, and lockdown. This means I'm going to typically need power, penetration, and cooldown reduction for him to work at his best. For the starter item, Boomba's Hammer seems really good. It adds more burst damage to my combos, comes with 20% built-in cooldown reduction, and offers CDR through the passive as well. Then, of course, boots are our first item, as always. Thor really doesn't need attack speed, tankiness, or movement speed as much as he needs raw power, so we go with Warrior Tab here. Now, as the jungler, I like to have a good early game power spike item that lets me gank effectively. Since we need power, penetration, and cooldown reduction, we could go for the Crusher or Jotun's Wrath. But maybe this game has an Aphrodite Maiden, so we'll go Brawler's Beatstick instead. After those first two items, Thor relies heavily on his ultimate to initiate a fight, so I think Arendite would be a good third item. It also has plenty of power and cooldown reduction, two of Thor's best stats. So I do like Heartseeker and maybe even Bloodforge on Thor, but it's a bit early in the game to be building such late game powerhouse items. I think we need one more mid game item in there before that. Since Thor uses AA cancelling very well in his combos, I think I'll go with the Hydra's Lament here, since it offers good stats for Thor in general. Around this time in the game, we'll be upgrading Boomba's Hammer, so that's basically your fifth item. Then in terms of a sixth one, either Heartseeker or the Bloodforge I talked about earlier would be pretty nice, but let's say I'm dominating and getting a lot of kills in this match, so I'll go for the Bloodforge. But by the time I get to selling my boots, things have changed in the match and I'm dying a little more in teamfights when I dive the backline, so I'm going to sell my boots for a Magi's Cloak instead of another damage item to keep me alive in teamfights a bit more. And there's a Thor build. This was just entirely off the top of my head based on Thor's stat pool and some game-to-game decisions. This wasn't a pre-made 6-item build I looked up, and I think it's a pretty decent build. It has anti-heal for the healer in this case, a bit of defense to keep me alive, a late-game powerhouse item in Bloodforge, the full 40% cooldown reduction between Boomba's Hammer, Hydra's, and Arendite. Granted, you now waste the cooldown reduction from Power Potion, which is something to think about, but this was just a build I made off the top of my head. It's likely not optimal, that's not really the point of this video. But hopefully this fairly short video helps you understand the thought process behind creating your own builds on the fly and not having to rely on a rigid set of 6 items that a pro player gave you 3 months ago that's likely outdated at this point. Next time you hop on Smite, try jumping into a game with a god you're not very familiar with but know a little bit about in terms of playstyle and what they do, then apply this method to that god and see what you can come up with. But that's all I got for this short one today. Have a great day, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.